Development Goals, the SDGs. Next, I'll go over some housekeeping. Quickly, please remember to mute yourself at all times. It is distracting for both the listener and the speaker, so please leave it off and be mindful. If you do have questions throughout the webinar, feel free to raise your hands, or you can write them down in the chat box, and we'll collect them and address them throughout the presentation. So today we're lucky to have Stephanie Berger, the Senior Specialist at Corporate Responsibility and Environment at Bell, who will be leading the session. Stephanie, before I wanted to, for you to get started, I wanted the audience to get to know you a little better and wanted to ask you a question on how you got into your current position.
I guess I had to unmute my line.
Yeah, very good, very good. Thanks for that. We're like all waiting in suspense. Awesome.
So was I. I had said something and no one answered.
Yeah, we're so happy to have you. So how did you become working at Bell as a corporate senior specialist of corporate responsibility and environment?
Actually, more than just sort of the role at Bell, I think it's interesting to say, you know, how I got to this career to begin with, because I started in New York City in on Wall Street filing initial public offerings for companies, and I just one day realized I had no soul left. I was figuring I was too old to be a rocket scientist or to go into marine biology, so I came back to Montreal and did an MBA, and completely by accident the stars aligned, and in my first semester of my MBA, I was exposed to sustainable development, what we called corporate social responsibility back then. And it was so clear to me immediately that this is an economic and business imperative, and we're not going to unknow this stuff. We can only go forward. So I became passionate and got lucky, quit my PhD, and Bell called and said, hey, would you like to interview? Wow. And I got the job. Yeah.
Awesome. That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I definitely appreciate to hear people's journey. So, and we're so excited to hear about Bell's specific journey for the EMS system and for other corporations that are interested in implementing this extensive system. So I'm going to let you take it away.
Okay. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So following on from that little introduction, when I was interviewed at Bell 5 years ago, I was asked if I knew how to implement an environmental management system, what I'll call from here on out an EMS. And I did. I had done a gap analysis for an organization before to determine whether it made sense for them to move forward with certification. So I thought I knew what I was talking about. But the interviewer followed up with more specific questions about operations of an EMS. And I didn't really know or understand what he was getting at. But today I know practice often looks nothing like the theory. What I had was the theory. What he was looking for was the practice. So despite the impression you may have from the reminder email about this webinar, what I'm not going to talk about today is how to implement an EMS, you know, the theory side. What I'm offering today is a look at the practice of how an EMS works by giving you an inside look at our system at Bell. And if you already have an EMS, you maybe will discover new ways of doing things. If you're just beginning your EMS journey, you're starting to think about what an EMS might do for you, I hope you'll go away with at least one example in your head concretely of what an EMS looks like in practice. So I just want to add that I also want to share sort of our guidelines for thinking and links between elements of our system so that we can share challenges. But just in case things get too technical, I do have our EMS experts on the line with me. I'd like to welcome Catherine and Ben. So don't be afraid to ask me really tough questions if it goes in that direction. Catherine and Ben can definitely jump in and help me out. But more specifically for me, I'm going to demonstrate how commitment, responsibility, simple structure enable replicability and continuous improvement in our EMS. So that's my job today. Your job is to speak up, ask questions, be an active member of the conversation. So I'm asking you to interrupt me. Use the little chat box. Raise your hand. Alex or Carlisle or someone in the GCNC team will make sure that we can hear you. I can always go back and figure out where we were at. The point is to have a discussion. I don't want to talk at you. I want to talk with you. So let's try those functions now. Get your fingers ready on your keyboard. Here's your question. Why would you implement an environmental management system? Why do you want to implement a management system? Why have you heard other people doing these kinds of things? Who's going to be brave? Alex, is there anything in the chat? All right, well, and I'll just tell you why we're doing it. If someone put something in the chat or raised their hand and we didn't get a chance, we'll get back to it. So the three predominant reasons for Bell were synergies, reputation, and reducing our environmental footprint beyond what we thought we could. So for the synergies, we have a transversal view of the company through our governance and replication of our structure in all the silos, otherwise known as business units, creates synergies that offer cost. Aha, someone's on the line. Alex? Okay. They offer cost reductions through things like economies of scale, especially for a large organization like Bell. We're almost 50,000 people, so there are a lot of places for us to replicate, but also through the elimination of the duplication of tasks, because you don't realize often how much is being done unnecessarily over and over again. So synergies also create similar expertise across the company, across business units, which is very helpful because it gives you sort of a uniformity of language and knowledge and a base upon which you can move forward together and commonly interpret and manage the environmental issues. Or honestly, if it's a different kind of a management system, any issues that you're managing through that system. When it comes to reputation, we think of it like this. You know, Warren Buffett, the very successful investor, likens good management systems to good management in general. And what he means by that is that if you're managing environmental issues responsibly, you are also likely managing the other aspects of the company responsibly. So your EMS, in essence, becomes a proxy for good management overall. And this is a positive for a company's image. It can have a positive return on investment for your investors, on customer lifetime equity, increased likelihood of forgiveness when things go wrong, and so on. And so the third thing that we had identified was that it helped us to reduce our environmental footprint. And it turns out that by setting goals every year for our EMS, we find ways to improve the company's environmental footprint in places we might never have looked otherwise. So this happens like once the low-hanging fruit has been picked and you need to find more projects. What happens is, as you're interacting with other people in the company, you start to sort of look more carefully at their operations or their processes or their systems. You start listening to their idle chatter in other departments more closely, and you become this kind of sentinel looking for the next big thing to tackle that you can put on your list for next year. And the best part about this phase for us is the overall increased awareness of our environmental programs throughout the company. And lucky for me, my job gets more interesting and I become more important because I go out and I try to insert myself in every team, get invited to every company meeting where people are sitting around and talking and they're introducing guest speakers to share what we're doing and to plant little seeds in their heads about how this kind of stuff connects to their job. And you'd be surprised how often we get the response back, wow, I didn't realize that my job really was that connected to all this. So I'm just going to stop because we didn't have a successful round the first time with the questions. Does anyone have any questions or comments before I dive into the meat of the presentation?
Hi, Steph. So it looks like we've had some responses to your earlier question that have come in privately, so I thought I'd just share them with the group.
Yes, please go.
Kelly has said that reason is to have improved environmental performance.
Of course, yes.
Raquel has said it provides a systematic way to implement a process that is externally recognized, and it allows for efficiencies. And then a final response from Walrick says, when you refer to environmental settings, this is a question. Do you include human interaction, human-environment relationship, and positivity, negativity of settings? And thanks, from Laura Gagliardo. Sorry about that.
Do you want us to repeat the question for you?
Yes, please. That's from Walrick?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. It just came in at the same time I started reading two of them.
Okay, go ahead, read it.
From Laura, and it says, when you refer to environmental settings, do include human interaction, human-environment relationships, and positivity, negativity of settings? Thanks.
Well, that's kind of sort of, those are general and vague terms, and forgive me for saying I see them as fairly obvious, because really when you see later on, Laura and Warwick, that our hierarchy, our structure is really created to create this kind of alignment between the structure, the processes, and the outcomes. And so the relationships between humans and also the relationship between their job and the environment becomes quite evident. I hope that I didn't sort of destroy your question by answering it that way. Before I move on, I wanted to touch on the externally recognized portion sort of an ISO type managed system. I mean, you could have an environmental management system that is based on ISO principles, but you can also get your system verified. And one of those things for us, in the reputation side, was that benefit of the external recognition, that you're not saying, by snapping your suspenders, yeah, we're great, we have a system and we manage it ourselves and we verify it ourselves. In addition, the outside world has come in and done an analysis and compared us to other things and best practices, and we have been and constantly are recertified. So definitely it has an impact on the external recognition. Any other questions?
That's it from the chat box. So thanks very much for the interaction, everyone, so far. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great. Please let the questions keep coming in.
Yeah.
And the comments as well. So, okay, so the meat of the matter, the basics. So most management systems work on the premise that you start with a plan, so in the upper right-hand corner. You implement your plan, you measure your results, you monitor deviances from the plan, you take corrective action, and you start the process all over again. More specifically, and this is the only slide where I'm going to give you any theory, in the plan phase, you kind of get your leadership commitment, you create policies, you define objectives and indicators and stuff like that. In the do phase, you're doing, operational control development, you're communicating to your key players, getting them involved, you're training your agents how to do it, that kind of thing. In the check phase, you're doing your gap analyses, conducting internal reviews and inspections, monitoring, checking your performance against your objectives. And in the act phase, you're taking corrective actions to address any kind of nonconformity or noncompliance. You're developing action plans to improve the areas where you've fallen short and based on what you've learned in the 3 previous phases. That's your sort of feedback section. I'm not going to stop here and ask any questions because I'm sure we're all in agreement about this. This is the theory. We're not interested in theory. We want to talk practice. So on to the next slide. Okay, so in the plan phase for us, that included drafting an environmental policy. This is our policy, and it gets reapproved, at the executive committee level every year. It's also available, by the way, on bce.ca in the responsibility section if you want to take it, copy it, mold it into your own thing. It's publicly available. Our guideline for thinking here is that if you have a policy that top executives commit to every year, that drives their commitment to everything in the policy and the items that then flow from this policy. So items like directives and procedures, roles, responsibilities, tasks, scorecards. Basically, what they're signing on to is whatever you're selling. But more importantly, the commitment from the top drives commitment below. So everyone else needs to row in the same direction. And I just wanted to point out a couple of important things that I think are in our policy, which, as the person coming in with a theory and not having experienced the practice yet, that I have sort of noticed and sort of been thankful for after the fact. The first thing is that we start with, this statement about our values. Bell Canada believes that environmental protection is integral and so on. So we start with, what is central to how we see ourselves. And then we make a commitment based on that. That's over here. We commit to minimizing through continuous improvement. And then later down, we state what we will do, not what we want to do, what we thought about doing, but what we will do. And we state these things, and actually, if you look closely, in fairly broad terms, but specific enough to create action items. So, for example, when you exercise due diligence in your approach to meet or exceed requirements of all applicable legislation, that could, at the beginning, mean the legislation of where your head office is, or Later on, it could mean the country, and further to that, if you expand internationally, it could mean, international labor organization standards and the promises you make when you're part of the Global Compact. So broad enough that we are not constrained by it and have to go back over and over again to the executive committee for permission to change it, but still constrained enough that it defines what should flow from it. Does anyone have any thoughts that they want to share on policies? Any other examples that they think are really good that people could use to craft their own, or problems with policies or this kind of an approach that they want to share? After this, we're going to have a look at how this kind of a commitment from the top drives responsibility throughout the organization. So if there's nothing coming in, Alex, I'm going to move on.
Feel free to move on.
Okay. So this here is an example of a letter that we have signed by officers throughout the organization to get their commitment. So we start with that top level approval with the policy, and then each business unit leader receives this kind of a letter stating the company's commitment, so reiterating what we said in that policy, and then requesting their active participation and the participation of the people in their units towards particular goals. And these leaders are asked to sign the letter. They sign their lives away, and they're asked to do this annually. And I think this is significant because it identifies the responsible parties in the company. It's not just this lofty statement about our values and what we will do. It's the beginnings of getting it done. And those people feel like they're going to be measured. So it makes the role an active one. And it also sets the stage, by the way, for performance reports later. They've signed on, they're going to then delegate it to their people, but they're going to get a report card later that says how their people did. And this is going to reflect on them, and of course, they report up to the people who are signing off on policy. So there's this hierarchical commitment and responsibility that you can't get away from. So I'm wondering here if anyone has an example of a management system that works without this kind of commitment from the top and this contractual relationship. And also wondering if you think that this is a good way to really get people involved in what's to come. After this, we're going to look at what those roles sort of look like when you delegate them out. Alex, shall I go on? Obviously, I'll wait for no one. I'm moving on with the promise from the business unit leader.
Steph, could you hear me? It's Alex. Sorry, I'm unmuting and muting at awkward times. So I had a question about buy-in from the top. So from your experience, do you need to kind of create a business case for this buy-in, like when dealing with, I guess, like the executive level, or was it just an easy sell? Essentially, that was my question on getting that buy-in. Was it an easy sell, or did you have to build a business case around it?
I can't speak for the history. We'll let Benoit be unmuted to give us the history because he was there from the very beginning. But on a theoretical level, I can tell you that that first slide where I showed you the idea about the synergy, the cost effectiveness, the reputation, and the reduced environmental footprint, for us, that is really the business case. That's clear. And then, by enacting things, you can have indicators that speak directly to those things. You can show performance, and you can show forward movement. You can show a trend toward those things. And, I mean, if anyone's been reading our reports year over year, not that I think you should, because, really they're all very boring. But you would see that kind of improvement. You would see that we start with a task that is new. We explain that we're developing the indicator. We know we want to do it. We haven't set a target yet. We're going to work toward that. We finally get a target. Then we start reporting against the target. And you can see that we're sort of learning as we go, but always making progress. And so leaders want to see that. They want to see where the rubber hits the road. As for the historical case of Bell, Benoit was there before we were even ISO certified, so he can tell you how that actually played out. Ben?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, good. So yeah, ironically, it's people from fleet services that created the environmental section within Bell around 1990. And basically it was because they had a regulation, the environmental regulation come into force in Canada, and then they say, okay, it's applicable to our company, so we have to do something about it. But if we are doing something about it, it has to be aligned with some sort of a standard. At the time, the ISO standard didn't exist, but they had that that idea that we have to have a systematic way to address the environmental protection in a company as the size of Bell Canada. So that systematic way was always there. And then when standards starting to be issued about how it can be systemized, we've been asked to follow those standards. And we did follow those standards very proactively, but without going out and saying that. For example, for the ISO 14001 standard, we were running our environmental management aligned with the standard without the certification for a long period of time, because there was not really competitive advantage of having the system being recognized. But then at some point in the time, it's the management who came back and said, you know what? We feel that it could be a competitive advantage if we are certified, if our environmental management system is certified, and it was coming from the high management. So I will say that it was kind of an easy sell at this point of time, and it always been agreed that managing the environment and managing the corporate responsibility is just good business.
Yeah.
So we had that alignment pretty soon in our life, I would say.
Great. So thanks so much. It's great to see that there was a buy-in in this case, which is awesome. Carlisle's going to express 2 comments from the audience right now.
Great. Thank you.
We're just getting some feedback. So Kelly has actually said that they have the same letter at BMO.
Oh, wow.
And Crystal says that it's a great idea and is wondering if the letter is very specific on what each business unit must accomplish, or it's just the main orientations.
The letter to the business unit leader is relatively vague. It expresses the values and the commitment the company has made, and it specifically asks them to commit their people. But while you'll correct me if I'm wrong, what we do, and we'll talk about it a little bit later in this next slide, is really get the buy-in on an annual level for specifically what they're going to do. So once we define the tasks, there's a negotiation period.
Okay, great. That's all the comments and questions for now. Feel free to continue.
Thanks. Keep them coming in. I just wanted to add to Benoit's comment because there would probably not have been an upper level management suggestion to get certified and to see it as a business, as a competitive business practice, had there not already been something there, had they not already been able to see performance and to understand where the company could go. And so that's, way back, between 1990 and say, 2010, for those companies who are sort of on their journey now and trying to make the case, you're looking for what is the business case, which sort of was backward style strategy in the Henry Mintzberg version of corporate strategy. So you'll need to be able to talk about things like we can reduce our footprint, and by reducing our footprint, we avoid fines, or we are going to be able to have competitive credits on the market, or follow legislation, or be able to get awards to attract the younger generation. There are all kinds of reasons which, I'm not going to go into them. I would be happy to with anyone who wants to have a follow-up webinar or some kind of small conference call or something like that to talk about it. I think that they're very obvious at this point. Whether or not you certify it, I'm not sure you need to. I think that you should definitely be able to make the case that you need a system anyway for a business imperative.
And sorry to interrupt, Stephanie, but what was a big boost also in the time about being very supportive of the EMS was the Sarbanes-Oxley where the personal responsibility of the board member, that gives us a little help to having a very robust environmental management system.
Yeah, it's always good when the law helps you get what you want. It always makes it easier. Okay, so somebody take a note that we'd be happy to talk about, you know, the business case for an EMS on another call. As for, you know, getting back to how it actually looks in practice, the reporting structure I think is worth looking at, because although the DNA of companies is different, you can sort of imprint this kind of a style on what you have and see your own deviations and what would work for you. For us, what works is having the section where it says SEHS, which is the executives who approve the policy. They're also the business leaders who sign the letter report to that level. And the SEHS committee reports through the CEO directly to the board of directors. So for us, having this annual promise or re-promise or reapproval of the policy gives the governance team, which is at the bottom, the power to engage the delegates. So it says EAT committee there, that's the environmental action team. That's a group of about 50 people across the organization that are working in the silos, in the business units. They don't work on the governance team. You know, they're the people who know, you know, how towers work. They're the people who know how manholes work. They're the people who know how, you know, the network is run. There are delegates that those business leaders have identified who are part of that committee, and they meet regularly and they talk about developments, including legal ones, like something like a Sarbanes-Oxley or a change in a regional system like in Ontario, for example. And they share resources, they share developments, they share ideas. So it sort of maintains this replicability, and it adds to that unified language and knowledge so that you can keep sort of comparing apples to apples-ish and oranges to oranges. And ultimately, those people, those, you know, environmental coordinators and others who report in there are responsible for individual tasks. A task, for example, that's about calculating the amount of garbage collected in your business unit. And there are about 1,000 or so on average, say, tasks every year that these people commit to in advance. So there's no surprise coming for them. They're part of the decision-making process. They're guided by the subject matter experts and the governance, which is the team that Ben and I and Kathleen work on. And we come to a mutual commitment that cover all the areas that our EMS covers, including contamination, pollution, building management, environmental training, and so on. And I think then the most important guideline for thinking here is the replicability of the structure. So the board of directors is always going to be the board of directors, the CEO is the CEO, the SEHS is a high-level committee. It doesn't matter if we make an acquisition, we're able to take this structure and replicate it, and automatically on the first day of implementation, there is someone in the business unit accountable for, you know, signing those letters. There's someone who's responsible for signing the letter. There's someone who's responsible for managing the task and making sure the task gets done and enlisting everyone needed to get that task done. And they're responsible for reporting at the end of the year, and all of those actions then come back up to the higher level again, the business unit leader, which then goes to the executive level again. So if we shrink or expand, break into smaller pieces, the structure is replicable. And the DNA of your organization might be different, so it might not look the same, but the idea is that organizational change doesn't dilute the responsibility that the management system asks you to incur. And I would argue, even if anything, it strengthens and expands it because more and more people get involved in sort of your goals. And so in the comment box, I was wondering if anyone had thoughts on this. Are there other structures that have worked for you? And while you're thinking about that, I wanted to let you know that the next slide is going to be a little bit more about how that sort of whole replicability looks, starting with that letter that's signed and going on to the scorecard.
Oh, looks like we have
so do the business unit delegates have time to do they have time allotted to dedicate to the environment? Do they have any enviro expertise? What about the coordinators?
Excellent question. So Ben will back me up if I get this wrong. Delegates negotiate their roles in their business unit. They almost, go through an interview with us. Ultimately, we aren't responsible for hiring them. The business unit has to delegate the task to them. In some cases, their performance goals for their job actually list this. In other cases, they get extra pay to do this in conjunction with another role they might play. What matters is it's fit into the organization structure. So regardless of the silo, the role is accepted in a structured way. We know who is responsible for the task, and we know what timeline, and we know what evidence we're looking for. Ben, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, yes, the piece that is missing is the CEP, that is the specific task of each of the business units. So when in the letter of assurance, when we're going to the officer, we are asking him to make sure that he's dedicating the appropriate resources to perform the environmental compliance or maintain the EMS within his own organization. And that's where the time of the environmental coordinator is captured, because for each of the business units, we are capturing the time that we expect the environmental coordinator will spend on. So when we are asking the officer, make sure that you're dedicating the appropriate resources, that's where it is catch. In terms of expertise, what we need in the business unit is not environmental specialists, because that knowledge is at the corporate level. We need people that knows their operation, that knows the nitty-gritty details of their operation, so they can operationalize the control point that we're putting together and the instruction that we want to implement in a business unit to make sure that they are complying with what needs to be done. So what we really need in the business unit is people that know their business. And what is nice is most of those people, if they're not environmentally knowledgeable, they are all all for it, meaning, it's easy to, I'm speaking, I guess we are all dedicated to the environment, but, we're working, it's easy to find people that has that value into them, and they're ready to do their share to protect the environment and having a sustainable world. So that's the beauty of the beast, I will say,
I can elaborate that by giving two examples. Say we have a small town in the north that has its own business unit, so it's self-contained. There will be what we call an environmental coordinator there. Because it's small, that person's going to know a lot. Their job will probably have, they'll probably have negotiated with their boss that it's going to take 75% of their work time, and the other 25% is whatever else they're hired to do. I don't know, payroll, let's say. And we do train them minimally, but they also have access to that bottom bracket there, the subject matter experts in the governance team at all times. We're there to support them continuously. In a larger group, let's say where there's 4,000 people and they do something like network installation, so they're out in the field in trucks and stuff like that, the person responsible may be an office person who might not have been trained in environmental stuff at all. They'll get the same training, but what they're able to do for us is take what we've provided. Let's say it's a sign that says, do not throw your compost in the garbage bin, and it'll look the same in that northern community as it will in that 4,000 person business unit, because the coordinators are delegating out. So in the northern community, that person who also does payroll may get off her chair and go and hang the sign herself with a hammer and a nail, but the person in the 4,000 person business unit might then engage other sub-levels of the company in order to affect things. So what really matters is that structure that we have. The governance team rolls things out through the coordinators. The coordinators have all the support they need from us, and they enact those things through those tasks.
Thank you so much for those excellent responses. We just have one more question from Crystal, wondering how often do coordinators meet, and what level are these coordinators? So are they at the director level, a manager, etc.?
The coordinators are usually, I would call a lower level manager. Often they will come to the meeting with their manager who is responsible for the operations of the management system. Those managers are delegated by the business unit leader. They will not necessarily always come. It can depend on the topic. Sometimes the topics of the meetings are very important and, you know, lend themselves to a higher level. They meet officially 3 times a year and can be called upon as necessary. Communications go out more often. As needed, all of the coordinators will receive, for example, if there's a new sign that's going out to how to sort your waste, or there's a new process, that might get emailed out. You might not need a meeting, or it might just be a conference call. Okay. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, that was perfect. That's it for questions, so you can feel free to move on.
Okay, great. We can always come back to this afterwards if you have more questions. So we're almost at the end of the presentation. I only have a couple more slides to go. This one is about how that structure creates the replicability. So, you know, at the beginning there in the upper left-hand corner, surprisingly backwards, I don't know how I flipped that graphic, the leader of the business unit signs his life or his or her life away and commits to supporting the policy. And so they support the policy by promising to designate a person and to report on the, you know, the value of the hours spent, the number of the hours that are spent working on this kind of thing, and making people accountable. They identify those people have then responsibilities related to the goals that we set annually for our system, that we have gone out as sentinels and collected and said, oh, we need to take care of, you know, responsible procurement. We need to add things to contracts. Let's put that on. And then there's a specific task that's designed around that goal. That person will receive the task in advance, agree to the task, perform whatever's necessary, and then provide us on the agreed upon date for the evidence. So let's follow on with the contract. A random sample of contracts that were pulled that show evidence of a clause for responsible procurement that was agreed upon in those contracts, for example. If it's a waste task, how much waste was collected for each category in whatever sort of value is required, whether it's by cost or by volume or by some kind of a weight. And then the performance is evaluated by the governance team. And with that evaluation, we create a scorecard. That's at the bottom right. And that scorecard goes back to the leader that signed that paper in the upper left-hand corner. And so everyone who's involved is constantly involved. And not only that, they're involved for the improvement along the way. So whatever you learned that didn't work throughout that process, by the time you get to the scorecard and you're being asked for improvement, filters back to the beginning where you start to plan again. And so defining tasks for every section of the company in the same way really helps here to be able to evaluate apples and apples and oranges and across business units, which is really helpful when you're trying to create a common language and a common experience of those environmental issues throughout the company. And also for those executives who are signing those letters to hear the same thing that their colleagues are hearing. It sort of reinforces. It's like if we're all calling sustainable development, and we're not calling it 85 things, it becomes a thing in their mind. And it's sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so essentially what you end up with is this alignment. So all these little business units, whatever size they are talking about the same things, are doing more or less the same tasks, and the information is being collated and sent up to the organization at the highest level to demonstrate performance, and then given back to the company to improve upon, which is really where the crux of the matter is. Because if you're going to implement an EMS, really, the raison d'etre is for continuous improvement. Because you want to address the deviations from the plan. You have a plan to control things. And where things are getting out of control, you want to create a system that's going to put them back in line and improve your performance.
Steph, we have a question from the chat.
Yeah.
Wondering, how do you validate the tasks that are done so that you can accurately report on the scorecard back to the business unit lead?
Again, that's part of the negotiation process. So, for example, the task might say, by February 15th, you must report the amount of plastic that was recycled in your unit for the year. So there's a start date, there's an end date, and then there's a date to report. There's often a template that's created. So the environmental coordinator or whoever is responsible for collecting that data will put the information in the format that's requested, and that is submitted to the governance team. We have a system, we have an electronic system that manages all this for us that's internally created. It has alerts and things like that. It tells you when you're overdue and all that fancy stuff. But essentially, you submit it officially through the electronic channels to the governance team. The governance team receives the notice that the task is complete, reviews the material that's supplied. They're an expert in their field, so we have someone who is very knowledgeable about waste management who will receive the evidence and can call that environmental coordinator or call the person in the business unit that provided that information and validate it, and then it's officially accepted. Or not.
Or not, yeah.
Yeah, depending. and that's where, of course, you would address a deviation, you would define a corrective action plan, set a timeline for that, you would follow up, and you would make sure the improvement is solid and that it's continuous, and the following year it should already, of course, then have been integrated into the new processes. But having this kind of a plan really helps to identify instances of deviation, and that's where you find a lot of the synergies, a lot of the extra sort of economies of scale or reduction of tasks that are being done by more than one person, because once the business unit goes looking for this information and they report it, then at that point you can say, oh, there's a problem with this, we're measuring it wrong, or the wrong person is measuring it, or they're measuring it twice and they're submitting inconsistent information, and it just gets better and better. It really is, I think, in Warren Buffett's words, a proxy for good management, period. It helps you to attend to the right things, because what gets broken is the squeaky wheel, and the squeaky wheel is the one that is deviant.
Great. Do you think you could talk more about the negotiation process, a little bit more detail about how that actually works?
At a sort of a high level, what happens is the experts take the plan from the previous year and figure out what's not appropriate anymore and new things that need to be added in, and basically a file is created with all of the tasks. Say there are 70 tasks for a particular business unit. The coordinator is contacted and provided that information. The coordinator has time to review the tasks and negotiate changes as necessary. So you might have, an agreement that, for a particular year there might be a problem and a task might only involve calculating, 75% of it because they don't have access to 100% of the data, that kind of thing. And once they come to an agreement on what the outcome is supposed to be, the task is sort of like set live in the system. That's really how it works. On either side, of course, there can be escalations, there can be many discussions. It doesn't happen in 24 hours. It happens over the period of, a month to 3 months, depending. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And then I'm just wondering, well, Teresa is wondering in the chat, how you do your compliance audits and whether it's internal or external personnel that performs them.
I'm going to call on Ben to unmute himself again while I explain that we have both. Every year we're audited externally through an ISO certified group, usually BSI. You can see that on our website, but also we have internal checks. Ben, you want to elaborate?
Yeah, well, it's exactly that. We have our own internal review that we're doing. We have external review from that is giving us our certification. We have our internal audit that are doing their own review as well, independently of ours. And also we have governmental inspection that are happening to sites, and they are part of observation. So if we have a governmental inspection about the petroleum products and they find discrepancies, those discrepancies are reported to us and are documented into the EMS.
And then
we have also,
I was just going to say, the other day we were talking about how, when we were talking about this chart and how I was creating it, you know, how it's really interesting for us that internal audit has an environmental coordinator, and they sit in on those committee meetings and they listen to everything we're talking about with all the different business units. And sometimes that helps them take topics that they think needed to be audited internally outside of our group. So it helps, again, with that idea that good management is good management, regardless of whether it's an environment or not.
Thanks. Kelly is wondering if Bell's EMS is certified to the 2015 version of the standard, the ISO standard, i.e. the 3rd edition.
Ken?
Yes, we feel that we are aligned, like we were for ISO 14000 before asking for the certification, but the formal blessing will be done this fall, where we will be formally audited at the corporate level as per the new standard. But I will say that we're 99% aligned with the new standard at this point.
Great, thank you. That's it for questions for now. If you want to keep going.
Yeah, let me just go back to where I was. So, you know, we're doing all this, of course, to monitor things and to get better and to align things throughout the company. And so for us, with 50,000 people, you know, 12 people in governance could never do it. And so for us, really having this replicability is really important, and having that constant feedback that goes all the way back to the business unit leader, who is reporting to the person that's signing annually to approve the environmental policy, really works. So before we get to some more questions and discussion, I just wanted to recap this for you. So in the beginning, we talked about, you know, what is important for us, why do we do this? And, you know, we started with, you know, a management system is good for finding synergies in the company that enhance the company's reputation, and it also helps to reduce our environmental footprint. And that a good management system really is based on that sort of plan, do, check, act, which is how ours is really structured as well. It fits and aligns tightly with that. And then that commitment at Bell starts from the top, is driven by the policy, which is signed annually, which ensures the dedication of the business unit leaders. And that helps to define the roles and responsibilities further down the structure. And that makes the structure actually quite simple, even though getting everything done is quite cumbersome, but the system itself is quite simple and replicable, especially when times of change are upon us, you know, like for all the acquisitions we've been making year over year recently. Key actors are responsible for carrying out those tasks and negotiating the specific tasks, reporting on the performance of those tasks, and those are then shared back to the leader who promised to support the system in the first place. And the fact that this is replicated across the business really unites and creates alignment throughout the organization so that we can compare apples to apples and create this common knowledge and language that reinforces, you know, the strategy of why we're doing this in the first place. And of course, we never rest because we're always looking for improvements to the system. It's the sort of the real pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And I just wanted to leave you with a final thought, and that's from the renowned management scholar Michael Porter, who said, the thing is, continuity of strategic direction and continuous improvement in how you do things are absolutely consistent with each other. And in fact, they're mutually reinforcing. And I would argue that it is essential in the area of sustainable development, which many of us operate in. So I don't have any more slides. I'd love to hear more of your questions and comments. Fill the chat box.
Could you share screen?
So as we wait for the questions to come in, I thought I would just ask one to start it off. So the idea of having a business unit delegate is really fascinating, and we're wondering if it is hard to engage the business delegates. Like how do you do it so that they want to do it and it's not becoming sort of a painful chore or another part of their, you know, their job, but they actually feel encouraged to that type of role?
That is definitely a managerial challenge that we face, you know, never mind just in our system, but day to day as we have employees that report to us. People come to work for different reasons, and it's always a challenge to motivate them to their highest level of output and engagement. we try to create a community. That's, one of the elements of these meetings that we have on a regular basis. We try to share stories, we share successes. We try to not let them feel so alone. It's true that they're alone in their organization and they're part of the company, and they can feel a little bit isolated. Some people are naturally given to doing this kind of thing, and those people are often good to lean on to share good experiences. But the fact is, it takes all kinds of people to run the world, and I'm not going to lie and say it's easy for every single environmental coordinator. Sometimes personalities can be tough.
Yeah.
And if I can add on that, Stephanie, is we're kind of lucky because the environmental management has so high visibility that when we are dealing with the middle management about who should be the environmental coordinator, they pay attention to who they are going to name in that position. And like I said, a lot of people have the environment and sustainable development at heart, even though if they're not environmental specialists. And I feel that we have a lot of our environmental coordinator that fits into that definition. So most of them are really enthusiastic about it. And what hurts me the most is when I've got an environmental coordinator that is so enthusiastic, he wants to do so many things, but like, if it cannot be replicable at the corporate level, we cannot do things that, they would have liked to do. They would like to the company being better and things like that. So sometimes we are in a position to slow down some of the coordinator. And quite frankly, we have other coordinator that it's on top of above their regular job, and they do their best, but we're not their priority. So it comes into flavors. But I will say that generally, we are lucky because people, the middle management tend to choose people that have the environment and the corporate responsibility at heart in their nomination.
Yeah, and I would add to that. There is such a thing as a corporate culture, but there's also business unit cultures. And when we're confronted with business units that maybe have less of a high visibility for this, we work hard to increase the visibility, and having that common language across business units and making it possible for those leaders to hear those key terms over and over from other business units really does help.
Perfect. Just for the sake of time, we have some questions waiting. Crystal says, thank you for the great talk, and is wondering how long you've had that electronic system in place for your EMS.
Oh, Ben, how long have we had that? Did we have it in paper before, right?
Yes, it was the very first version was on paper, and when we were asking about modifying a task, you should see the people who was doing the coordination at the time. It was kind of crazy. Then we moved to Excel, but on the web-enabled platform, I will say 2008 around.
Thanks. What were your top 3 challenges, and how did you and your team deal with them?
Ben, you want to try that one?
Well, even though, Stephanie, what I like in the presentation is that the structure doesn't affect our environmental management system, but we are challenged by the change, the day-to-day change, because it's over 40 business units that we have to deal with. So that means 40 environmental coordinator, 40 TURB signatory, but at the end it's 8 EVP. So maintaining that structure and that ability and knowledge about the 40 business units of the importance of maintaining the system and making them aware about their task, I would say is one of the challenges. It's a good news because Bell is very dynamic. We're growing year over year, but that's one of the biggest challenge.
Yeah, and I think when we were discussing what topic to bring to the spotlight today, something that I found interesting is, getting this done in a company of 50,000 people is a challenge just in the idea of it, of how to get it done. And And the fact is that through acquisitions, companies change a lot, and tracking people can be very difficult, and figuring out which VP replaced which VP and which director changed which director, following, you know, the bouncing ball can be a little bit difficult. But having that structure really is the key. That's the crux that makes it all work. I think, Ben, I think you'll agree with me on this. One of the things that we'd like to know more of and more accurately is how much time is spent on this stuff. It's easy when you've got someone whose job is just to be the environmental coordinator for the business unit, because 100% of their hours are dedicated to this. You know exactly how much they're paid, so you can figure out what the budget is. But there are people who, you know, they say, you know, it's 50-50, but then they might spend 65 instead of 50. It would be really nice to know exactly how much time and how much money is invested on the business unit level. We know on our side because 100% of our time is dedicated to running these programs. What do you think, Ben?
Well, yes. I'm dreaming that you know, we try to capture the resources like Stephanie said, and we are calculating. We are asking how much has been expended on resources, on real expense, and also on capitalization. But it's not with the same level of rigors of our financial people. So yes, there is this is another challenge.
Yeah.
A couple of people are wondering how many people you actually have assigned 100% of their time dedicated to tracking the EMS or running it.
Well, that's most of Ben's job. Karin's on the line also. It's pretty much all of her job. That's on our team. And then there are a couple of people amongst the sort of 40 or 50 environmental coordinators, depending on how the business unit is structured, that have it. But Ben, do you know the exact number?
Well, I don't have the exact number, but depending of the level of detail of the question, because I feel that all our team are supporting the environmental management system. So I will have it, and we're doing a hell of a good job, because we are kind of, overall, at corporate level, we are 14 members that taking care of the operation across Canada and some operation in the U.S. So I think that we are very efficient on that side of the business, and and we have like about 50 other environmental coordinators that are supporting us through that journey. Most of the environmental coordinator in a typical business unit is about 35%. I'm assuming that they're spending about 30 to 35% of their time on environmental issues, and with the exception of one group that is paying more attention about the realty services issues, everything related to buildings, where they have a team of 5 persons that are dedicated to the environment. But yeah, it gives a little bit of flavor of the effort.
It takes a lot of energy. I mean, this cannot be done by one person, I think is probably the safe answer. No, Crystal, you can't do it yourself.
We are out of time, unfortunately, but there are still a number of questions left over. So if it would be okay with you, Steph, I might forward those on to you, and then if we could provide the participants with our slides, the recording, and then potentially some answers to these questions, that would be
absolutely. I'd be happy to.
Great. So first, I'd like to thank Stephanie and Benoit from Bell for sharing their insights. Thank you for tuning in, and our GCNC team, specifically Carlisle and Amy, for supporting the facilitation of this webinar. Bell was able to share their environmental process and the scalable nature of it. Now I have a call of action for you as a listener. If you have an initiative or system that you want to share and that other organizations can learn from, we have a portal in which you can share. We have the SDG Awards on September 28th, and the application process is due this Friday. So if you have a best practice or sustainability initiative that you feel others can learn from and you want to highlight, this is the opportunity for you to do this. So that's all. I'm going to call this webinar a wrap, and I want to thank everyone again, and stay tuned for our anti-corruption launch webinar next Wednesday. Thank you. Yeah.